This is a difficult passage. This is a passage that has created much hardship in our world throughout history. It is a passage that is punishing, blaming, that pits men against women, that is responsible for a lifetime of women being afraid of snakes. But as we said last week, this story is not a scientific beginning of the world. This story, this creation story, is a story that was told by ancient people to kind of explain what they saw around them. And it is a story about the spiritual state of humanity. Now you know, or perhaps you have heard the doctrine of original sin. I went to church on my holidays, and I heard the doctrine of original sin praised and upheld. Now, I don't know about you, but it is a long time since I praised the doctrine of the fall or the doctrine of original sin. I have reinterpreted them. And I would have been content to leave it there if I had not heard a wily and eloquent praise of that doctrine. And then I thought, we are foolish if we do not talk about it and if we do not help ourselves find words to deal with it. So the doctrine of original sin, I want to talk to you about doctrinal things today. That is a Christian belief in the state of sin in which humanity has existed since the fall of man, which stems from Adam and Eve's rebellion in Eden. Namely, it is the sin of disobedience to God in consuming the forbidden fruit. This doctrine places side by side what we talked about last week as the original blessing when God called and created people into this place of innocence and beauty and abundance and love and playfulness with God and co-creation with God. And it was beautiful. Enter this doctrine of original sin, and suddenly human beings are not beautiful. They're not good. They don't live in abundance. This is the dark side, we're told. And it isn't until Jesus Christ comes that the scales are balanced. Have you heard this? Yes? I don't believe it anymore. And I think it grew out of a time in the Christian movement when we had just become, the Emperor Constantine had said, settle all your differences and Christianity is going to be the official religion of the state. So come on side. In the 4th century. And Christianity was consolidating itself. and it was consolidating its beliefs. You know, the doctrine of original sin and the fall of man was not even talked about until the 2nd century. It didn't come with Jesus. So I want to suggest to you today, one, that we let the Hebrew Bible stories speak for themselves. That we don't try to make the Hebrew Scripture stories about Jesus. Let them stand as wisdom teachings on their own. And let us not look at this with the 2nd and 3rd and 4th eyes of doctrine. But let me reframe this story for you in a way that I have come to believe is more authentic and more true to my life experience. Last week we talked about the phase of innocence. It's almost like Adam and Eve were in the garden and they were sheltered from anything bad happening by God and staying within the rules. And it's like when you have your children in your life and they're very small and you try to shield them and guard them from everything. You don't want anything hard or bad to come to them. But there comes that moment in every child's life where they test the limits. It's part of their growth. Our job as parents has always been to help them and guide them and protect them when they needed protecting, but set them free when they were ready for the next stage, the next step, as they found their way to maturity. I want to suggest to you that it is in human nature to do exactly what Adam and Eve did in this story. God has called them and created them to be co-creators. Well, you cannot be creative without testing the limits, without pushing the limits, without wondering, is there a different way? You just can't do it. You can't confine creativity. And so Adam and Eve have this idyllic life, but they push the limits. And then they push a limit that just goes one step too far, or that actually opens a door for them so that they move into the next phase of their life and of their maturing. Do you get this? Can you see it? Like, it is the development that I think we all go through as spiritual people. Brené Brown said that you can't have growth without chaos. Because you have to let go of what you thought in order to think something new. So, what if the serpent really represents chaos? What if the serpent is an agent of maturing? What if the serpent is that inner voice in all of us that says, you know what? We're ready to take the next step. We're ready to experience something new. One of the big pieces about maturing as individuals, and I would say as a culture, the biggest hurdle is learning how to take responsibility for our own actions. How many of us have, in our process of growth, made a tremendous mistake, or even a little mistake? Just done something we wish we hadn't done. And we learn from it. But we also have to learn how to take responsibility for what happens because of our mistakes. I think that's a tremendously difficult phase of human development. To be accountable. To let the truth speak. It is particularly difficult, I think, because it's interesting in the story, after Adam and Eve ate from this tree, they knew they were naked. At those times in our lives, when we have felt spiritually naked, when people have seen too much, or we have seen too much, and we feel exposed, it is at those moments that it is perhaps most difficult to take responsibility. But that's part of what it means to mature as individuals and as society, as cultures. I think we see that in all the apologies that happen in our culture to the Japanese people, to the indigenous people. We're saying as we look back, we as a culture are saying as we look back, we see that we've been wrong. And we can't change the wrong we did except by being accountable for it. I've fallen in love with Louise Penny, the Canadian author who writes the Inspector Gamache books from in Quebec. So there was a young man who was involved in a car accident and resulted in the death of a 7-year-old child. Now that's big to live with. He went to prison and he got clean and sober, began to work a program that helped him see that he had to take responsibility for what he had done, and he had to make amends. So when he got out of prison, he went to the home of the grandfather, or of the father, and he said, "I'm so sorry." The father told him, "Get out." And he did. But that next week, he came and he cut the grass. And the next week, he came back. And he did it again. And he looked for things he could do. Never spoke to them. This went on for a year of him making amends in his actions, not just in his words. And at the end of the time, at some point, the father realized he was sincere and he truly had changed his life. And at that point, they were able to effect some forgiveness. Not forgetting, but they found a way forward. This passage, if we wouldn't have made it into this big doctrine thing, I think tells us something about how we spiritually grow up. And if it would have not set out to punish us and condemn us and judge us, it could have helped us to see that actually mistakes are part of life. And that as we mature, it will be how we deal with our mistakes that is a huge part of the maturing. So Adam and Eve, as we leave their story today, we hear they've been expelled from the garden. But they're ready. Out of the chaos that's happened, out of their nakedness, they've been able to see that they're ready and they are more independent. And yes, there'll be more hardships come their way, but that's part of what independence is. That's part of what growing up is. Well, I think you got the point. I don't know if you agree with it, but I think you got the point. So if you're talking to somebody who wants to talk to you about original sin, say, I have a different take on that story. Thank you for listening.